He sent me a wedding invitation, not an apology, not a phone call, a wedding invitation. My name written in calligraphy on cream-colored paper, not the name I carried for 14 years of marriage. My maiden name, like I had been filed away, processed, returned to factory settings. And at the bottom, the date, 6 weeks away. The venue, his name, her name. He wanted me there. I stood in my kitchen in a bathrobe that used to be his, mismatched socks on my feet, coffee going cold on the counter. And I understood, with the kind of clarity that only arrives after a long, long time of not wanting to see, exactly what this invitation was. It was not an olive branch. It was a front row seat to my own humiliation. He wanted to stand at that altar next to his 29-year-old fiancée. He wanted to look out into the crowd. And he wanted to find me sitting there, red-eyed, diminished, the proof that he had moved on and I had not. He had been watching me for over a year. I didn't know that yet. A folder on his laptop, my LinkedIn, my work, a photograph from a fundraiser. He had been monitoring the woman he left, watching me slowly rebuild, and he had told himself that rebuilding was just another word for damage. He thought I would walk in broken. He thought he knew exactly what I had become without him. He was wrong. And on that Saturday afternoon, in a deep emerald dress, walking through brass doors with a billionaire CEO beside me and his security staff 2 steps behind, I showed him exactly how wrong he was. Not for revenge, not for performance, for myself. Only for myself. This is that story. The greatest act of courage after being diminished is not revenge, it is returning to yourself. If this story speaks to something you've carried, stay with us, like this video. Leave a comment below telling us, have you ever had to walk back into a room where someone expected you to be broken? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because every week we bring you stories about women who choose themselves. This is one of them.
The mail hit the floor at 7:43 in the morning. Claire heard it from the kitchen. That small sound, paper on hardwood, the soft, specific thud of something arriving that you did not ask for. She was standing at the counter with her coffee. Real coffee, the kind that took 4 minutes to press and smelled like something worth waking up for. She had started buying the good beans 3 months after the divorce. A small act, nobody's business but hers. The bathrobe she was wearing was too large. It had been Derek's once. She had kept it not because she was sentimental. She had kept it because it was warm, and she had not yet replaced it with one of her own. Small things took time. She was learning that. She walked to the front door. 3 pieces of mail on the floor, a utility bill, a catalog for a garden she didn't have, and a cream-colored envelope with heavyweight paper and the slight shine of something formal. She picked it up. Her name was written in calligraphy on the front. Ms. Claire Whitmore. She stood very still. Not Claire Ashford, not Ms. Claire Whitmore Ashford, not the awkward hybrid that some people had used in the first year after the separation, unsure which name she was going by. Just Claire Whitmore. As though 14 years of marriage had been processed, filed, and returned. As though she had been reset to factory settings. Her hands knew what this was before her brain caught up. She opened it slowly. She did not tear it. She slid her fingernail under the seal the way her mother had taught her, the way her mother opened every piece of mail, regardless of what was inside. Mr. Derek James Ashford and Miss Brittany Lynn Cole request the honor of your presence at the celebration of their marriage. The date: 6 weeks from Saturday. The Meridian Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago. Claire read it twice. Then she set it on the counter next to her coffee and looked at it. Her first thought was small and specific. He used my maiden name. She noticed it the way you notice a paper cut. Not immediately painful, and then all at once. Her second thought arrived right behind the first. He wants me there. She sat down on one of the kitchen stools. She was wearing socks that didn't match. One gray, one with small green leaves printed on it. She had not replaced the drawer organizer she used to keep in the bedroom. The system she had maintained for 14 years, the small, invisible infrastructure of a shared life, had come apart, and she had not yet built a new one. She looked at her mismatched socks. She looked at the invitation. The phone buzzed on the counter, a text from Peggy Donovan. "Did you get it yet?" Claire stared at the screen. She typed back. "Get what?" Not a question. She already knew. Derek's wedding invite. He sent them out this week. My cousin Carol got one. Apparently he's inviting basically everyone from your old social circle. Claire. A pause between messages. Then, he's doing this on purpose. Claire looked back at the invitation. Peggy texted again before she could respond. "You don't have to go. You know that, right? You don't have to do a single thing." But Claire was already thinking something she couldn't quite say out loud yet. She was thinking, he sent me this because he wants to see me fall apart. He wants to stand at that altar next to a 29-year-old woman and look out into the crowd and find his ex-wife sitting there with red eyes and a fixed smile. He wants that image. He has built this entire invitation around having that image. She set the phone face down. She finished her coffee. It had gone slightly cold. She tasted it anyway. Bitter, flat. The way things taste when your mind is somewhere else entirely. The house she was renting in Evanston was a 2-bedroom with a backyard the size of a generous closet. The house she and Derek had shared in Naperville was a 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch and a kitchen that had been photographed for a real estate magazine once. She had designed that kitchen. She had chosen every cabinet and countertop and drawer pull. She had walked away from it and not looked back. That surprised people. It had surprised her too, at first. Then she understood. She had not been attached to the house. She had been attached to what she thought the house represented. She got up. She put the coffee cup in the sink. She walked to the living room where her laptop sat open on the coffee table. Work files spread around it. A strategic analysis for a technology firm due Thursday. Real work. The kind she used to do before she became Derek Ashford's wife. Before she became his hostess. Before she became the silent infrastructure of his professional life. She sat down. She opened the laptop. She stared at the screen. Then she picked up the invitation and read it a third time. Ms. Claire Whitmore. Listen. 14 years. She had cooked dinners for his clients and dressed in ways that complemented his image and shelved her own ambitions like winter coats in August. Patient, folded, still there but not needed right now. She had been Claire Ashford. She had built herself into the architecture of that name, and he had simply unmailed it, returned her to factory settings. He probably hadn't even thought about it. He had probably told his assistant or Brittany or his mother, use her maiden name, that's who she is now. As though identity were a label you swapped out. The cursor on her laptop blinked. She closed the invitation. She slid it under a book on the coffee table, not throwing it away, not framing it, just setting it somewhere she could think about it without staring at it. She texted Peggy back. I got it. 3 dots appeared. Then, what are you going to do? Claire looked at the book hiding the invitation. She looked at the laptop. She looked at the window where the morning light was doing something warm and honest on the wall. She typed, I don't know yet. Then, quieter than she expected, a thought arrived. It didn't feel like rage. It didn't feel like grief. It felt like something harder to name. It felt like the particular clarity that arrives when you finally stop being surprised by someone. He wants me to walk in there and be the sad one, the leftover one, the proof that he moved on and I didn't. He wants the image of me crying at his wedding so he can tell himself the story he needs to be true. She thought, I have not yet decided whether I'm going, but if I go... She did not finish the thought. Not yet. She opened her laptop. She started working. The invitation sat under the book. The cursor blinked. 14 years. She was 42 years old. She had been a corporate strategist with an MBA from Northwestern before she put that away. She had been good at it. She had been on track for partnership within 5 years. That was a different woman. Or the same woman, very far away. The phone rang at 9:15. She looked at the screen. Helen Ashford, Derek's mother. Claire held the phone for 2 rings. Then she answered. Claire. Helen's voice was warm and slightly ashamed. I told him not to send it. I want you to know that. I told him it was unkind. Claire said nothing. She waited. He said he was being generous, Helen continued, giving you the opportunity for closure. A pause. He always did have a talent for calling his cruelty generosity. The honesty of it landed somewhere quiet in Claire's chest. I just wanted you to know, Helen said, that I think you should come. Not because he deserves to see you, but because you deserve to see what you've become. The call ended. Claire sat for a long time in the quiet. She was not crying. She was thinking about what Helen had said. You deserve to see what you've become. She thought, what have I become? She didn't know the full answer yet, but she was beginning to want to find out. Her email pinged at 9:45. A message from Nora Stafford at the consulting firm. Maxwell Harrington's office just called. He wants to discuss bringing you on as lead consultant for the Q1 restructuring at Harrington Ventures. He specifically asked for you by name. Claire, I've never seen him request a specific consultant before. Meeting tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., say yes. Claire read the message twice. Maxwell Harrington. She had heard the name. Technology holding company, privately owned. The kind of quietly significant operation that didn't need to announce its net worth because the rooms it occupied did that work automatically. She typed back, yes. Then she looked at the book, hiding the invitation. Something had shifted in the air of the room. She couldn't name it yet, but something had shifted. The offices of Stafford Consulting Group smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner, and the particular ambient hum of people doing competent work. Claire had been here for 14 months, started as a contract analyst, moved to senior consultant 8 months in. Now she was the person Nora Stafford called when a project needed someone who could read a failing organization's structural problems in 2 meetings or fewer. She had forgotten she was capable of this. That was the thing she had not expected about coming back to work, not the difficulty, the forgetting. How completely she had put away this version of herself, how thoroughly she had learned to be something smaller. She was wearing the teal blazer. She had bought it 6 weeks after moving into the Evanston rental. Derek had preferred she dress in neutrals, not a rule. Just a preference he had expressed often enough that she had absorbed it without noticing. The teal blazer was not neutral. She loved it with a specificity that surprised her. Maxwell Harrington's team arrived at 9 on the hour. 3 people from his executive staff. His chief of staff, a precise woman named Diane Fletcher, who had the bearing of someone who ran meetings the way a conductor ran an orchestra. Everything in its place, everything on time. Diane shook Claire's hand at the start and said, Mr. Harrington reviewed your preliminary brief this morning. He had some reactions. Her expression offered no clue as to whether the reactions were favorable. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Claire presented her initial analysis of the Q1 restructuring problem. She spoke precisely. She did not over-explain. She had relearned in 14 months the difference between confidence and performance. Confidence was quieter. It didn't need the extra words. As the meeting was ending and Claire was gathering her notes, Diane slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "From Mr. Harrington," she said. Claire picked it up. It was handwritten, dense, slightly slanted script. Not a summary of her analysis, but a direct response to it, point by point, pressing her arguments further, asking harder questions, engaging with her work the way someone engages when they are actually reading and not just receiving. Claire stood there and read it. Her first thought, he's right about the third point. Her second thought, he's missed something significant on the first one. Her third thought was the most interesting. I want to be in the room when he realizes he missed it. She said to Diane, "When can I meet him?" Diane looked at her with mild, interested attention. "Thursday," she said. "He cleared his afternoon." Claire nodded. She took the page. That evening she went home to the Evanston rental. She made pasta, a real sauce, the slow kind her mother made, the kind that took 45 minutes and filled the apartment with warmth. She ate alone at the kitchen table. She had been learning that alone and lonely were different countries. You didn't have to live in both of them just because you were in one. She was washing the dishes when the text arrived. Derek's number. "Hey, I know the invitation was a surprise. I hope you'll come. I think it would be good for both of us. Closure, you know." Claire stood at the sink, warm water over her hands. She read the text 3 times. Closure. She knew exactly what he meant by that word. He meant, "I want to see you accept this. I want to see you smile and shake Brittany's hand and tell me you're happy for me. I want the story of our divorce to end in a way that makes me not the villain. I want you to give me that." She set the phone down. She finished the dishes. She dried her hands on the dish towel. Small blue stripes, chosen by her, paid for by her. She thought about Derek. She had been practicing this privately for months. Not hating him, not missing him, just trying to see him clearly. He was a man who had grown up being told he was exceptional and spent his adult life being moderately successful, which is not the same thing, and had felt the gap between those two facts as a personal failure he could never quite account for. When he looked at Claire, he had seen a mirror, but the mirror kept showing him a reflection that wasn't quite tall enough. When Brittany looked at him, she saw the exceptional man he had been promised he was. He had not left because Claire wasn't enough. He had left because she was too much. Too much history, too much shared reality, too much person who had seen the distance between who he was and who he thought he should be. He was not a monster. He was a coward. The difference mattered. You could not hate a coward the same way you hated a monster. You could only feel something quieter and more exhausting, a kind of low-grade sorrow for the waste of it all. She did not respond to his text. She opened her work files instead. She spent 2 hours preparing for Thursday's meeting with Maxwell Harrington. In the morning, Peggy came for coffee. She sat at Claire's kitchen counter the way she had sat at kitchen counters for 21 years of friendship. Immediately comfortable, shoes off, reaching for the good mugs without being told where they were. "He texted you," Peggy said. Not a question. He said, "Closure." Peggy made a sound, not quite a laugh. "Of course he did." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "Are you okay?" "I keep trying to figure out if I'm angry," Claire said. "I'm not. Not exactly. It's more like I look at the way I remember him, and the image keeps getting smaller, like he's standing at the end of a hallway that's getting longer." Peggy was quiet a moment. "That's called perspective," she said. "Takes a while to develop." He called it closure. He called it closure because that word is about him, Peggy said. Everything is about him. She looked at Claire over the mug. "You know what? I never told you this. I didn't want to make things worse when you were in the middle of it. but I never thought he was good enough for you. Not once. Not in 14 years. Claire looked at her. You never said anything. You loved him. Peggy shrugged. It was a simple shrug, without apology. What was I supposed to say? I think your husband is a small man wearing a large man's confidence. You wouldn't have heard it. You had to get there yourself. Claire thought about this long after Peggy left. You had to get there yourself. She was getting there. Slowly, imperfectly, without fanfare, arriving at a version of herself she was only beginning to recognize. That afternoon, she opened her old graduate school folder. She had been meaning to look at it for weeks. She found her MBA thesis. She opened the first page, she read her own words, and she did not recognize the woman who had written them, not because the words were poor, because they were excellent, precise, confident, full of an intellectual boldness she had completely forgotten she possessed. She sat back in her chair. The feeling in her chest was not grief and not pride. It was something more fragile than either, something that needed careful handling. This was me. Before I made myself small. This was me. She closed the file. She did not cry. She sat and looked at the wall for a while. Then she wrote a note in the margin of her current work file, a specific argument she wanted to make on Thursday. And she went back to work. She was not the woman who wrote that thesis. Not yet. Not fully. But she was getting closer. I'm not crazy. I know what I was capable of. I know who I still am underneath all of this. The thought arrived without her summoning it, but she held on to it. The conference room on the 22nd floor had a view that cost money. Chicago spread out beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass, the lake flat and gray in the October morning, the buildings doing what buildings do when they are tall enough to feel significant. Claire arrived exactly on time. She was wearing the teal blazer and a white blouse and dark trousers, not performing competence, simply dressed like herself. Maxwell Harrington arrived 3 minutes after her. She had seen his photograph on the company website. A man in his late 40s who looked slightly impatient with being photographed. Taller than the photograph suggested. He had the quality that certain people have of entering a room without announcing themselves, simply present in it, and then the room slightly different than it was before. 2 staff members with him, a young assistant with a notepad, and a quiet man who positioned himself near the door in a way that was professional rather than dramatic. Part of the architecture of Maxwell Harrington's daily life, she would come to understand. He sat down across from her. He looked at her the way people look when they are actually paying attention, not scanning, not running a social checklist. Actually there. You found the flaw in my 3rd-point argument, he said. Not hello, no introduction. Directly to the work. And you found the gap in my first one, Claire said. A brief pause, something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, a small thing, like a person who expected a door to be locked and found it open. I did, he said. I wanted to see if you knew. I knew? Why didn't you correct it in the brief? Because I wanted to see if you were reading my work, Claire said, or just receiving it. Another pause. Longer. And? You're reading it. He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded, once, and said, Tell me how you'd fix the Q1 restructuring. She told him. 40 minutes of being exactly the woman whose thesis she had read the night before, not performing expertise, having it, the cleanest she had felt in years. Like standing in a room with good, honest light after a long time in dim spaces. When the meeting ended, and he stood to leave, Maxwell paused at the door. He said, without turning back completely, You've been underusing yourself. Whoever was responsible for that made a serious mistake. He left before she could respond. She stood in the conference room for a moment after he was gone. The city was still there, beyond the glass. The lake still gray and flat and real. She thought, yes. And also how strange to hear it said, plainly, by someone who has known me for 40 minutes. She drove to her mother's house that weekend. Donna Whitmore lived in the same brick ranch house in Indiana she had lived in for 35 years. The garden was aggressively maintained. The kitchen smelled, as it always had, like coffee and something recently baked. That morning, it was the apple bread her mother had been making every October since Claire could remember. Claire had been coming here more since the divorce. She had not come enough during the marriage. Derek had found her family low-key, his word for ordinary, his word for not impressive enough for his professional social circle. She had absorbed his assessment without realizing she was doing it. She had let one person's dismissal of her origins quietly rewrite how she saw them. Her mother fed her lunch without asking if she was hungry. Donna Whitmore had been a nurse for 35 years. She understood that asking people if they were hungry gave them too much room to say no when they needed food. After lunch, Claire helped reorganize the guest room. Moving boxes, rearranging a bookshelf, the practical work of small domestic spaces. That was how she found it. Her mother went still when Claire opened the cardboard box on the top shelf. "I kept it," her mother said quietly. "I always thought you'd want it back someday." Claire lifted out the diploma. The frame was still good. Her mother had wrapped it carefully in brown paper. Northwestern University, awarded to Claire Elizabeth Whitmore. The date, 15 years ago. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about that year. She had been 27, fresh from graduation, her first position at a downtown consulting firm, on the track for partnership in 5 years or fewer. She had been excellent at it, with the natural certainty of someone doing exactly what they were made to do. Then she had fallen in love with Derek Ashford at a mutual friend's birthday party. And within 2 years, she had made what she thought was a choice, and what she now understood was an erosion. He had not told her to quit. He had not issued commands. He had simply made her feel, incrementally and persistently, that her career was a complication, that traveling for work was a form of neglect. That ambition in a wife created a particular kind of loneliness for a husband. He had said these things in quiet moments, in the kind of gentle tone that made them sound like love rather than expectation. She had not heard it as demand. She had heard it as need. "I need you here." And she had stayed. She held the diploma. Her mother stood watching her. Donna Whitmore was 68 years old and had spent her career in rooms where things were genuinely at stake. She had the quality of such people. She did not fill silence with noise. "I forgot I was good at something," Claire said. Simply, not as a performance of realization, just the truth arriving. Her mother said, "You never forgot. You let him put it in a box." Claire looked at her. Her mother looked back. Neither of them said Derek's name. They didn't need to. The diploma was there. The box was there. 11 years of it sitting in a guest room closet were there. "I'm going to his wedding," Claire said. Her mother did not react with alarm. She did not offer approval or warning. She said, "All right." "He wrote my maiden name on the envelope, like I never had his name." "You don't anymore?" "No." Claire looked at the diploma again. "I want to go, not to hurt him, not to prove anything. I want to go because I want to see what I feel when I'm in that room." She paused. "I want to know whether he still has power over me." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "And if he does? Then I need to know that. And if he doesn't?" She set the diploma down on the bed. "Then I need to know that too." She took the diploma home that night. She hung it on the wall of her home office, Northwestern University, Claire Elizabeth Whitmore, She stood in front of it for 3 full minutes, not crying, not celebrating, just looking. Somewhere along the way, I became invisible. I let myself become invisible, but I was always still here. I was here the whole time. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in weeks. In the morning, driving to work, she called Peggy. "I'm going to the wedding," she said. Silence. 3 full seconds. For Peggy Donovan, who had been talking since approximately birth, 3 seconds of silence was a geological event. "Okay," Peggy said. "Okay. If you're going, you are going dressed like the most extraordinary version of yourself that has ever existed. This is not a discussion. We are going shopping. This is happening," Claire laughed. It sounded real. A voicemail was waiting on her phone when she arrived at the office. Derek's number, but Brittany's voice. She sounded young, slightly uncertain. The voice of someone who had been building up to something for a while. "Hi, this is Brittany. I know this is weird. I know everything about this situation is weird. I don't know why Derek sent you an invitation. I want you to know it wasn't my idea. If you come, it won't be strange from my side." A pause. "Anyway, okay." Claire listened to it twice. She thought about Brittany Cole, 29 years old, works in marketing. She had Googled her once, in the first month after the divorce, and then closed the browser tab. She had not looked again. There was nothing she needed to know. The other woman in a marriage is rarely the main story. She had known that, even then, through the fog of it. She thought about this voicemail, the slight uncertainty in Brittany's voice. The way she had said it won't be strange from my side. As though she was already carrying more of the weight of this situation than she'd bargained for. Claire saved the voicemail. She didn't know why. She went to her desk. She started working. The diploma on the wall of her home office was still there when she got home. She had expected it to feel like grief. It felt like something else, something smaller and more specific, and in its smallness, more survivable. It felt like recognition. The property meeting was at a realtor's office in the western suburbs, a vacation house in Wisconsin that their lawyers had been slowly resolving for 18 months. The last shared thing, the last administrative thread connecting her life to his. Derek had insisted both of them be present. Claire had agreed. She arrived 5 minutes early. He arrived 7 minutes late. She watched him walk across the parking lot. And she had the experience she was not entirely prepared for. He was smaller than she remembered. Not physically. He was the same height, the same build, the same slightly expensive haircut. But something about him had reduced in scale since she had last seen him face to face. He was wearing a blazer that cost more than it should, and the watch he always wore to meetings where he wanted to project success. She noticed these things the way you notice stage props. After you've been behind the curtain. After you've seen how the scenery is assembled. He saw her, and his face did something complicated. Pleased to have produced a reaction. Nervous about what the reaction would be. Performing ease over the top of both. He smiled too quickly. "Claire," he said, "you look—" "Let's get through the paperwork," she said. Not unkindly, simply directly. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The realtor talked about comparables and listing timelines. Derek talked slightly too much, the way he always did when he was uncertain about something. Claire answered questions directly and signed where she needed to sign. In the parking lot afterward, he tried. "I'm glad you're coming to the wedding," he said. "I haven't confirmed. Helen said she called you." "She did." He stood with his keys in his hand. She could see him gathering toward something. She waited. "I want us to be okay," he said. "I want there not to be bad feelings." "There aren't bad feelings," she said. It was mostly true. He blinked. She understood what had happened in his face. He had expected the residue of pain, something that would confirm his ongoing significance in her emotional life. He had expected her to be in the process of recovering from him. The possibility that she might have recovered already, that she might be somewhere on the other side of that recovery, had not occurred to him. I mean, I know it's been hard, he said. It's been a process, she said. Brittany, Namdam. He stopped. It wasn't about you not being enough. I know, Claire said. And she did know. That was the thing he hadn't understood. She had already done this work. She had already arrived at the place he was trying to walk her toward. She had not needed him as a guide. He looked at her with something she wasn't expecting. It looked almost like loss. You seem different, he said. I am different, she said. Good different, he said. Something in his voice was not entirely celebratory when he said it. She said goodbye. She got in her car. She drove 3 blocks and pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat for 5 full minutes, not crying, not shaking, just sitting. She had prepared, quietly and without acknowledging it, for this encounter to cost more than it did. She had steeled herself for impact. The impact was manageable. He was a person she had once loved. He had made choices she could not approve of. He was now something she needed to file correctly in her life, not erased, not centered, but filed somewhere that was accessible but no longer load-bearing. She was not the mirror. She had never been the mirror. She texted Peggy. Saw him at the realtor meeting. The response came in seconds. And? He's smaller than I remembered. 3 seconds, then, I have been saying this for 14 years, Claire laughed. It sounded completely, entirely real. She went back to work. The second meeting, with Maxwell Harrington, was that same week, her team presenting to his executive staff. She had prepared with a thoroughness that was not anxiety, but pleasure. She was doing what she was capable of, and that knowledge had a different weight now than it used to. It lived in her body differently. The presentation went cleanly. After his staff filtered out, Maxwell stayed. He was looking at the final slide, a structural recommendation that she knew would make his board uncomfortable. They won't like this, he said. They're not supposed to like it, Claire said. They're supposed to fix it. He looked at her, that specific way of his, not scanning, actually present. You've been doing this for a long time. I should have been doing it longer. A pause. What were you doing instead? She considered the question. Prioritizing someone else's story, she said. He nodded slowly, not with sympathy exactly, with recognition. I did that once, he said. It costs more than you expect and less than you fear. He paused. That's not my line, my therapist said it. Claire looked at him. She had not expected that. Does it get cheaper over time? She asked. Yes, he said. Once you stop paying. He gathered his notes. The board presentation is in 4 weeks. I'd like you in the room. I'll be in the room, she said. He left. She stood for a moment in the emptied conference room. She thought about what he had said. It costs more than you expect and less than you fear. She thought, yes, that was exactly it. The leaving had cost more than she anticipated in the first months. The ground beneath her had been less solid than she realized. But the thing she had feared most, becoming nothing, becoming nobody, becoming the sad leftover woman at the bar of her ex-husband's wedding, that had not happened. She was still here. She was still herself. Somewhere in the Evanston rental, hanging on the wall of her home office, her diploma was doing its small, quiet, patient work. She drove home, she cooked dinner, real food, the slow kind. She ate it at the kitchen table and thought about the board presentation and the specific argument she wanted to make, and the look on Maxwell Harrington's face when she had said, they're supposed to fix it. Not because she wanted to impress him, Because she had been right, and she had said so, and she had not apologized for either. I deserve better than silence. I deserve to take up the space I need. I always did. The thought came without effort. That was the difference lately. The truths were arriving on their own. She didn't have to reach for them anymore. Brittany Cole had not planned to call Claire Whitmore. For months she had avoided even saying Claire's name out loud. Not because she was jealous exactly. She had won, hadn't she? She was the one Derek had chosen. She was the one with the ring and the venue deposit and the cream-colored invitations and heavy cardstock. But Derek got a particular look on his face when Claire's name came up in conversation. A look that was not quite sadness and not quite guilt and was exactly enough to make Brittany feel like she was living in someone else's house. Like she had moved into a space that hadn't finished belonging to someone else. And then she had found the folder. She called on a Thursday afternoon. Claire was at her desk working through the Harrington analysis when the phone rang. Brittany's name appeared on the screen. She answered. "I found something on Derek's laptop," Brittany said. Her voice was careful, the voice of someone who has rehearsed this opening and is now getting through it. "There's a folder. He's been tracking you. Your LinkedIn activity. The consulting firm's client announcements, articles where you're quoted. There's even a photograph from a fundraiser you attended in September." A pause. "I don't know what to do with what I found." Claire was very still. The apartment was quiet around her. The diploma on the office wall, the small sounds of the building settling. She asked, "How long has the folder been there?" "Since..." Brittany's voice dropped. "I think since before the divorce was even final." Long silence. "Claire." Brittany said her name quietly. "He didn't invite you to the wedding because he wants closure. He invited you because he wants to see what he did to you. He wants to see you reduced." Another long silence. "I know," Claire said. "You already knew." "I knew the shape of it," Claire said. "I suspected." "Doesn't it make you..." Brittany stopped. "Angry?" Claire looked at the diploma on the wall, the frame her mother had kept carefully for 11 years. "It did. For a while." She paused. "Now it just makes me sad for him. He's building a new life, and he cannot stop looking back at the old one. He is watching me rebuild, because watching me rebuild threatens the story he needs to tell himself." She paused again. "That is his prison, not mine." Brittany was quiet for a long time. "He is going to be so surprised when you walk in," she said finally. "Yes," Claire said. "He is." Another pause, then from Brittany, something Claire had not expected. "I'm sorry. For my part in all of it. I was 27, and I believed things he told me about your marriage that I shouldn't have taken at face value." Claire absorbed this. "Thank you," she said. She meant it entirely. The call ended. She sat for a long time after it. The apartment was quiet and held her. 11:30 at night. She had lost track of the hour. The street outside had gone to its late-night rhythm. Occasional car, occasional footstep. A dog somewhere. Up the block, barking twice and then stopping. She made tea. She did not drink it. She thought, who am I when I'm not his wife? The question had been circling for 18 months, arriving in pieces, in fragments, in the middle of the night and in the middle of conversations she was only half present for. Tonight she let it arrive whole. Who was she? She was a woman who could read a failing company's structural problems in 2 meetings. She was a woman whose mother had kept her diploma in a box for 11 years on the faith that she would want it back someday. She was a woman who bought the good coffee and wore the teal blazer and had started doing her hair the way she used to before she learned Derek preferred it different. She was a woman who laughed at something Maxwell Harrington said, and the laughter was not performed. She was a woman who was awake at midnight, not from fear but from thinking. She was someone she had been trying to remember for a very long time. She did not cry. The kitchen held her. The kettle slightly warm, the tea untouched, the diploma in the next room doing its small, patient work. I was here before you. I will be here after. In the morning, she called Peggy. We're going shopping, Claire said. Peggy said, finally. They went on a Saturday morning, 4 stores before they found it. It was not what Claire had expected. Not a power suit. She didn't need that kind of signal. Not red. She didn't need that kind of announcement. It was a deep emerald green, floor length, structured beautifully, at the shoulder, and it moved when she walked with the quality of something that meant business without having to say so. She put it on in the fitting room. She looked in the mirror. The feeling that arrived was too large to name quickly. You're being very quiet, Peggy said from the other side of the curtain. Is that good quiet or the other kind? I look like myself, Claire said. She said it slowly, like she was identifying something she had been searching for and finally located. I look like who I actually am. A beat. Then Peggy said, very quietly, Yes, you do. She bought the dress. The Harrington Board presentation happened that week. It went exactly as Claire had predicted, and slightly better than she'd hoped. The board resisted her structural recommendation, as boards always resist things that require them to acknowledge error. She held the line. She had prepared for every objection, and she answered each one without flinching and without apologizing. Maxwell watched her from across the table with the attention of someone watching something they find genuinely interesting. Afterward, walking to the elevator together, he said, You didn't back down. The analysis was correct, she said. People back down from correct analyses all the time, he said. She thought about this. I used to, she said. It became a habit. She paused. I'm breaking it. He nodded. The elevator opened. Before they stepped in, he said, I have a charity dinner next Thursday, the Art Institute. I'd like you to come. A pause. As my guest, not as a consultant. She looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing pressuring in his manner. He was simply asking. He had the quality of someone who made requests without needing them to be answered a particular way. All right, she said. He nodded once. Good. That evening, Ted Barrows emailed. He was her divorce attorney. Methodical, dry-humored, thorough in the way of someone who had seen enough divorces to know that the financial details people overlooked in the emotional chaos were always the details that mattered most. The email was about the Wisconsin property. In investigating the final listing, he had found a discrepancy. Derek had significantly undervalued Claire's contribution to his real estate business over the years. Specifically, the unpaid strategic and organizational work she had done that had directly supported his business development. The undervaluation was not small. He had written a number at the bottom of the email. Claire read it. Then she read it again. She sat back in her chair as she thought all those years of making myself smaller, all those years of calling it love instead of calling it what it was. And he had filed it correctly in his own ledger the whole time, as an asset that belonged to him. Starting over feels impossible, but staying was worse. And the starting over is working. It is actually working. She forwarded the email to Ted with a single line, Let's proceed. The Art Institute on a Thursday evening in October. The building did what the building always did. It imposed a certain seriousness on anyone who walked through it, a reminder that some things were built to last. The charity event was in the grand ballroom, full and warm and lit with the particular glow of a room where people had dressed carefully and were performing being at ease with varying degrees of success. Maxwell's car arrived at Claire's rental at 7 on the hour. His 2 security staff, the quiet professionals who moved through public spaces as part of his daily architecture, were with him, as they always were. He stepped out of the car and looked at her. She was in dark blue tonight, saving the emerald dress for Saturday. Her hair the way she used to wear it before she had quietly adjusted to someone else's preference. He did not perform being impressed. He simply looked at her and said, "You look like someone who just remembered something important," she laughed. "Is that a compliment?" "Yes," he said. "It is." The dinner was everything such dinners were. Crowded and warm and full of conversations happening at multiple levels simultaneously. Maxwell navigated it with the ease of someone who had been in such rooms for a long time. Not arrogance, just the steady competence of a man who had long since stopped needing rooms to confirm him. He was recognized, quietly, immediately, by enough people that there was a gentle gravity to his presence in the space. He introduced Claire simply, not as his consultant, as someone I've been fortunate enough to work with. She filed that language carefully. Between the first course and the second, he set down his fork and looked at her and said, "Tell me about the years you lost." She looked at him. "I'm not being intrusive for the sake of it," he said. "The gap in your professional history is notable. Your capability is significant. There is clearly a story." She considered deflecting. She was good at deflecting. She had practiced it for years. She said instead, "I married a man who needed me to be less than I was. I was young enough and in love enough to think that was a reasonable accommodation. By the time I understood what I'd given away, I had been giving it away for a decade." She paused. "It's not a unique story." "No," he said. "But the fact that it isn't unique makes it more infuriating, not less." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me I should have fought harder for my career." "I would never say that to someone who survived something I don't fully understand," he said. She held this for a moment. Around them, the dinner had its own weather. Laughter and glassware and the warm noise of a large room doing what large rooms do. She and Maxwell were sitting in a quiet within it. "I'm rebuilding it now," she said. "The career, myself. I'm in the middle of remembering who I am." "I know," he said. "How do you know?" He looked at her. "I watch how you are when you're working versus how you are in social situations. In social situations, you have a small habit. You make yourself slightly smaller. Pull in, lower your voice. When you're working, that habit disappears entirely. You take up exactly the space you need." He paused. "The work version of you is the real one." She was quiet for a long moment. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I'm attending my ex-husband's wedding this Saturday." Maxwell raised his eyebrows slightly, not in judgment, simply in attention. "He invited me expecting me to be visibly diminished," she said, "to serve as proof that he moved on and I didn't." "And did he?" "He's been maintaining a folder on my professional activity for over a year," she said, "monitoring my LinkedIn, articles I've been quoted in, a photograph from a fundraiser." She looked at her wine glass. "So? No. He has not moved on. Not in the way he thinks." She paused. "I want to go to the wedding. I want to walk into that room and feel nothing, not revenge, not performance, just nothing where he used to live." A pause. Then Maxwell said, "Would it help if you didn't walk in alone?" She looked at him. "I have a friend coming." "I meant me," he said. She held his gaze. "That would send a very specific message." "Yes," he said. "It would." He held her gaze steadily. "Is the message inaccurate?" She thought about this for a long, specific moment. She thought about who she had been 1 year ago. The woman in the too large bathrobe, the mismatched socks, the woman trying to remember her own name on an envelope. She thought about who she was right now, in dark blue, in a beautiful room, being seen clearly by someone who paid actual attention. "No," she said. "It's not inaccurate." He nodded once. "Then I'll come." she told Peggy the next morning. On the phone, Peggy went silent for 4 full seconds. This was, by any historical measure, unprecedented. Then, the CEO with the security team. Yes, Claire said. 2 more seconds. Harrington Ventures, the company that's worth... Peggy? Claire Elizabeth Whitmore. Yes? I love you. I have loved you for 21 years, and I need you to know that this is the best story I have ever been a part of in my entire life. Claire laughed until her sides hurt. Ted Barrows called that afternoon to confirm he was moving forward with the financial discrepancy claim. The number had not gotten smaller overnight. If anything, he had found additional supporting documentation. Derek undervalued your contribution significantly, Ted said, in his careful, methodical way. The courts will likely agree. Thank you, Ted, Claire said. 14 years of unpaid strategic work is not a rounding error, he said. You were his silent business partner, Claire. The paperwork just didn't say so. She hung up the phone. She thought about Derek's text. Closure, you know, she thought. I am building my own closure, from the ground up, with my own hands. You don't get to name what this is. You never did. She went home. She looked at the emerald dress hanging on the back of her closet door. Saturday was 3 days away. She was ready. Friday night, the apartment quiet. The emerald dress hung on the back of the closet door. Floor length, structured at the shoulder, the color of something that had decided to be itself. It was not a weapon. It was simply who she was. She could not sleep, not anxiety exactly, or not only anxiety. It was more like the specific alertness that arrives before something shifts. The feeling of standing at the edge of a thing you've been walking toward without knowing it. She got up at 2 in the morning. She made tea. She drank this one. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about Derek. She waited to feel something sharp arrive. Something with teeth. What she felt was mild, a low warmth that was not quite affection and not quite indifference. Something like, this person mattered to me, and tomorrow I am going to watch him marry someone else, and I am going to feel this mild warmth, and then I will go home and continue my life. She thought about the folder he had kept, the LinkedIn monitoring, the fundraiser photograph, the year-long quiet surveillance of a woman he claimed to have moved past. She thought, he saw me coming back to myself. He watched it happen from a distance, and it frightened him. That is why he sent the invitation, not because he is purely cruel, though the invitation is cruel, because he watched her becoming again and felt the specific terror of a man who realizes he is no longer the most significant thing in the room he used to own. She picked up her phone. She looked at old photographs, not of Derek, of herself. Her graduation, 22 years old, laughing without performing happiness. A solo trip she had taken after college, just herself in a backpack, and 3 weeks through the Pacific Northwest, before she had known that such independence would one day feel like a lost language. A birthday party at 30. The last photograph before the erosion was complete. She was smiling, and she looked like someone who still recognized herself. She looked at the woman in those photographs. She looked at the woman who would be at that wedding tomorrow, same person. More of her now, not less. She set the phone down. She thought about Maxwell, about the dinner, and the way he had said the work version of you is the real one. The way that had landed, not as flattery. She had learned to receive flattery and set it down quickly. This had been something different. It had been recognition. It had gone through. She thought, I am not going to the wedding for Derek. I am going for myself, to close a door, not because Derek deserves closure, but because I deserve to see that I can close it myself. I deserve to stand in that room and feel free. That was the real thing. That was the only thing. The door of her prison had been unlocked the whole time. She was her own jailer. She had to choose to stop. She went back to bed. She slept eventually in the way of someone who has resolved the question that was keeping them awake. In the morning, Saturday morning, the morning of the wedding, Peggy was at her door at 9 with coffee and an energy that could only have been building since approximately Wednesday. "Okay," Peggy said, handing over the coffee. She was already fully dressed, earrings and everything. Hair first, then makeup, then the dress. You are going to walk into that room looking like the best version of every single good decision you have ever made in your entire life. "That's a lot of decisions," Claire said. "Then you have a lot to look like," Peggy said. They worked through the morning together. Peggy did not fill it with noise. There was music on low in the background, and the small sounds of the apartment, and two women who had been friends for long enough to know when words helped and when they didn't. When Claire put on the emerald dress and stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bedroom, Peggy sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He is going to see you walk in, and he is going to understand, for the first time, exactly what he gave up." Claire looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like herself, the real version, the one who had been waiting in a box on a guest room shelf for 11 years. "Good," she said. At noon, Maxwell's car was outside. He stepped out in a dark suit, appropriate for a wedding he had not originally been invited to, which was itself a quiet statement. His two security staff were with him, professional, unhurried, present. He looked at Claire when she came down the front walk, and the expression on his face was not performance. It was the actual thing. "Ready?" he said. She thought about the word, ready. She had been getting ready for 18 months, maybe longer, maybe since she first put her thesis in a drawer at 31 and told herself she'd come back to it later. "Yes," she said. They got in the car. Peggy settled into the back seat. She looked at both of them. She pressed her lips together in an expression of profound, barely contained emotion. She reached into her purse and produced the small flask she had brought. She tapped it once against her knee in a gesture that functioned as a toast. "Peggy," Claire said. "I'm fine," Peggy said. "I'm completely fine." The Meridian Grand Hotel was 20 minutes away in downtown Chicago. Claire watched the city go past the window, the lake catching October light, the buildings doing what they did, the ordinary and extraordinary of it. She thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. She was not performing anything. She was simply on her way. Her phone buzzed. Helen Ashford. "I'm already inside," Helen said. Her voice was warm, faintly amused. "I'm on the left side. I requested the seat. The bride's side, technically, but I believe they made an exception." A pause. "I wanted you to know. You are going to walk into that room, and you are going to be exactly who you are. That is more than enough." Another pause. "Also, I may have mentioned Maxwell Harrington's name to 7 of the guests I know. I may have suggested they watch the entrance." Claire looked out the window at Chicago. "Thank you, Helen," she said. "Don't thank me," Helen said. "Just walk in." The Meridian Grand Hotel's event entrance was a set of tall brass doors that caught the afternoon light. October in Chicago, that specific gold, honest and unsparing and beautiful in its honesty, the kind of light that shows things as they actually are. Claire stepped out of the car. She was in the emerald dress, her hair the way she used to wear it. She looked like herself. Maxwell stepped out beside her. His security staff fell into their discreet positions. Not dramatic, not conspicuous, simply present in the way that was simply how Maxwell Harrington moved through the world. Peggy was on Claire's left. The dress she had spent 3 months of budget on was worth every dollar. Her expression was one of absolute, composed, barely contained triumph. They walked toward the entrance. The small crowd of arriving guests near the brass doors did not part dramatically. This was not a film. People looked up the way people look up when something has entered their peripheral vision, and then a few of them looked longer. Because Maxwell Harrington was a name and a face that a certain set of Chicagoans recognized, quietly, without announcement. And because the woman beside him was walking in the particular way of someone who had arrived, truly arrived, at themselves. Through the brass doors and into the lobby, more guests. The warm noise of a large gathering still assembling itself. The smell of cut flowers and hotel air and someone's expensive perfume in the air near the entrance. Claire looked around the room. She looked for Derek. He was near the entrance to the ceremony hall, talking to two men she vaguely recognized, business contacts, the kind he collected and maintained for professional reasons. He was laughing at something, his public laugh. She had heard his private laugh for 14 years, and she knew the difference, and this was the public version, managed and deployed. He had not seen her yet. She did not speed up. She did not slow down. She walked, Derek's laugh caught and stilled. He saw her. Claire watched it happen across the distance of the lobby. The specific sequence of his expressions, arriving one after the other, like cards being turned over. First, recognition, the brain registering a known face. Then, inventory, the automatic filing of details, the dress, the hair, the way she was standing. Then, Maxwell Harrington, a different quality of attention when he registered this, something shifting in his chest that was visible in his face. Then, the security staff, taking inventory of them. Then, back to Claire. His face did something she had not predicted and did not have precise words for. It was not devastation. It was not anger. It was not even the jealousy she might have expected. It was the face of someone who has just discovered that the story they have been telling themselves contains a factual error so fundamental that the entire structure may need to be rebuilt from the ground. He had thought she would walk in diminished. He had thought the invitation was a cruelty she had no answer to. He had thought she was still in the house of her grief, measuring the rooms, living in the outline of the life that had ended. He had monitored her LinkedIn and her articles and her fundraiser photograph for over a year, watching her slowly rebuild, and he had told himself the rebuild was evidence of damage, that watching her start over confirmed the loss. He had not accounted for what starting over could actually become. Claire met his eyes. She waited for the feeling, the sharpness, the old wound reopening, the specific pain of being in the room with the person who had looked at you and decided you were not enough. It did not come. What arrived instead was quiet and clean, something with no venom in it and no performance. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, not as a power move, not as a statement, not as proof of anything, simply, I see you, and I am not afraid of what I see. Then she looked away. Peggy, at her elbow, breathed out slowly, one long, steady breath. Maxwell said without turning his head toward Derek. All right? Yes, she said. And she was. They found their seats. Helen Ashford was in the third row on the left side, exactly where she had said she would be. She caught Claire's eye and gave a single small nod. The nod of a woman who has been waiting for this confirmation for longer than she has let on. Around them the room filled. The murmur of recognition that Maxwell's presence created moved through the gathering in the particular way such things move in rooms where social capital matters. Several people came to greet him before the ceremony began. He handled these interactions with long-practiced ease. Claire watched him do it. She thought, this is what he navigates every single day, the gravity of being recognized everywhere he goes. And he brought it here. For me, not as performance, as presence. She deserved to be here. She deserved exactly this. I am not the leftover one. I am not the sad one. I am the one who showed up as myself, and that is the most powerful thing I could have done. The ceremony doors opened. The music began. The ceremony was a ceremony. Flowers and music, and the formal architecture of a public commitment. The specific gravity of a room full of people watching two people make promises. Brittany Cole came down the aisle in white. She was young and genuinely lovely, and she moved with the self-consciousness of someone who knows she is being watched and is managing it. But underneath the ceremony composure, Claire saw something else, a slight wariness in her eyes, the look of a person who has been told a story about their own life and is beginning to examine whether all the details hold together. Derek stood at the altar. His voice was steady when the time came. He was performing steadiness. Claire could see the management of it from where she sat. The deliberate angle of his chin, the careful arrangement of his expression, a man performing certainty in front of everyone he knew. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel grief. She felt present, simply present in a room, witnessing a moment that had once owned her and now did not. Maxwell was still beside her in the particular way of someone who is genuinely comfortable wherever they are. The vows were exchanged, the rings, the kiss. The room broke into applause. Claire clapped, genuinely, not as a performance of forgiveness or generosity, but honestly, this was a moment in someone's life, and she was present in the room for it, and she could acknowledge that without it costing her anything. The reception was 2 floors up in the hotel ballroom. During the movement of guests from the ceremony hall to the elevators, Claire slipped out to a balcony that looked over the city. The Chicago skyline did what it always did in October. The lake dark and specific in the distance, the buildings catching the last of the afternoon light, the city doing its enormous and ordinary business. She stood there for a minute alone. Then Peggy found her. Peggy leaned against the railing and said nothing for a moment. Just stood. Just looked at the city. This was the thing about 21 years of friendship. You knew when the silence was for, and you let it be. Then, well, I feel fine, Claire said. Fine like still processing, or, fine like fine, Claire said. Like it's over. The part of my life that had him at the center. It's over, and I can feel that it's over, and it doesn't feel like loss. She looked at the lake. That's what I came to find out, whether it would feel like loss. Peggy looked at her. And? It feels like a door that was always open that I'm finally choosing to walk through. Claire was quiet for a moment. I stayed afraid of this for so long. The idea of being in the room where he's with her. I thought it would break something open in me that I'd never be able to close again. It didn't, Peggy said. It didn't. Because the thing I thought he had taken from me, my capacity to be the real version of myself, he never had it. I gave it away, and I have it back now. Helen Ashford appeared on the balcony. She came to stand beside Claire, and for a moment, the 3 women were quiet together, looking at the city. 3 women of different ages who had been watching this story unfold from different distances. Helen said, "He saw you come in." "I know. He hasn't looked away from the door you came through in the last 20 minutes. Claire nodded. She did not look back toward the ballroom. "He thought you'd come in broken," Helen said. "He needed you to come in broken. He's been watching your career rebuild and telling himself it was evidence of damage, that starting over confirmed the wound." She paused. She was very careful with the next words. "I raised him. I know his faults better than anyone alive. He is my son, and I love him, and he is also a man who has always needed to be the most important presence in every room. He cannot tolerate the possibility that your room no longer contains him." Claire thought about the folder, the year of quiet surveillance. "I know," she said. Helen looked at her directly. "You are extraordinary. I thought so when he brought you home 14 years ago. I think so now, standing on this balcony." She paused. "I am sorry he couldn't see it while he still had the opportunity to." Claire put her hand on Helen's arm for a moment. Not too long, the right length. They went back inside. The ballroom was warm and full, flowers on every table, the band beginning to set up, the specific hum of a large gathering settling into its next phase. Maxwell was talking with two guests near the bar. Effortlessly, in that specific way of his, he saw Claire return, and the quality of his attention shifted, the way a compass shifts when it locates its direction. Derek was also at the bar. He saw her. He made a small motion, a slight step in her direction, the beginning of a conversation he wanted to have, perhaps needed to have. Claire met his eyes. She did not move toward him. She did not move away. She simply held his gaze for a moment, steady, clear, carrying nothing she had not chosen to carry. Something crossed his face. The closest thing to honesty she had seen from him in years, the face of a man who has finally understood the full dimensions of what he let go. Then he looked away. She turned toward Maxwell. He tilted his head slightly. A question, without words. She shook her head slightly. "I'm all right," he nodded. Peggy appeared at her left elbow with 2 glasses of wine produced from somewhere with the efficient timing of long friendship. "Here," Peggy said. "We are celebrating." "What are we celebrating?" Peggy looked at her, the look of 21 years of knowing someone. "You," she said. "Just you. Only you." Claire took the glass. Then Brittany Cole crossed the room toward her. She was slightly flushed. Champagne, probably, or something more complicated. She stopped a foot away from Claire. Up close, she was younger than Claire had expected, and more unsure. The wariness from the ceremony was still there, the look of someone examining the story they've been handed. "You look incredible," Brittany said. "Thank you," Claire said. A pause, then quieter. "I'm sorry, I think I knew some things I pretended not to know. About the timeline, about some things he told me." She stopped. "I should have asked more questions." Claire looked at her. A 29-year-old woman standing in her wedding dress, admitting a small, difficult truth on the day that was supposed to be entirely uncomplicated. "I know," Claire said. "Take care of yourself, Brittany." She meant it. Every word of it. Brittany's face changed. The wariness shifted. Something behind her eyes went more open, like a window that had been stuck and finally moved. She nodded once. She walked away. Claire watched her go. She hoped genuinely that Brittany Cole would be all right. She hoped this, the way she hoped for things that were real and possible, and not her business to control. She turned back to the room. Maxwell was beside her. "Ready to go?" he said. "Yes," she said. They did not stay for dinner. There was nothing left here that required her presence. She had come to see what she would feel. She had seen it. She was done. Not dramatically. Simply, she had done what she came to do, and she was ready to go home. They said their goodbyes. To Helen, who gripped Claire's hand for a moment and said nothing that needed words. To Peggy, who could not quite contain her expression and did not try. They walked out through the brass doors. The October evening had come up while they were inside. Cooler now. The city had shifted into its evening mode, lights coming up in the buildings, the street traffic different, the air carrying that specific October smell of leaves and cold approaching. She did not look back at the Meridian Grand Hotel as they got in the car. She looked forward, in the car, going home. The city moving past the windows, Chicago in the evening, lit and enormous and entirely itself. Peggy had her head against the back seat window. She was watching the city go by, with the expression of someone experiencing the satisfying conclusion of a story they have been invested in for a very long time. I need approximately 3 business days, she said finally, to process everything that just happened. Then we are having dinner, and I am going to talk about this for approximately 4 hours. That seems fair, Claire said. Maxwell said nothing for a while. He was looking out his own window, the city and the quiet between them. Then he said, "How do you feel?" She thought about the question carefully. She gave it the consideration it deserved. "Empty," she said, "but not the bad kind. The kind like when you clean out a room that's been full of things that weren't yours. You stand in it after, and the space is just space, ready for what's actually supposed to be there." He nodded. He understood this. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." I wanted to be there," he said. "That was not a favor. That was a choice I made for my own reasons." She looked at him. He looked back, the particular quality of his attention that she had been slowly learning to simply receive instead of deflecting. Ms. Claire Whitmore. She thought about the envelope, the cream-colored paper, the calligraphy, her maiden name written as erasure. She thought, he didn't erase me. He returned me to myself. The car pulled onto her street, the Evanston rental, with its small boxwood hedge and the porch light that buzzed slightly and needed a new bulb. Peggy looked at both of them. She pressed her lips together one more time. Then she said, "Okay. Final question. As your best friend of 21 years, Maxwell Harrington." "Peggy," Claire said, "I need to know if I should be happy." Claire looked at Maxwell. Maxwell looked at something on his phone with the elaborate patience of a man pretending not to hear the conversation in which he is the subject. "You can be happy," Claire said. Peggy made a sound. It was the sound of a woman who has been vindicated by the universe in a way that exceeds language, but requires vocalization anyway. She got out of the car and walked inside, not without dignity, but quickly. Maxwell walked Claire to the door. Not because she needed an escort, because he wanted to. She understood by now the difference between the things he did out of obligation and the things he did because he chose to. The difference was significant. They stood on the front step, the porch light buzzing, the October night cool and specific around them. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said. "Not a work dinner, not a charity event, just dinner. You and me and a restaurant I've been wanting to go back to for 2 years." "Yes," she said. He smiled, a real one. The kind she had learned was uncommon and therefore worth something. "Good night, Claire. Good night, Maxwell." She went inside. She stood in the hallway for a moment in the emerald dress. The apartment was quiet. It was warm. It was entirely hers. She walked to the home office. The diploma was on the wall. Northwestern University. Claire Elizabeth Whitmore. She stood in front of it. She had stood in front of it many times in the past 2 months. Each time it looked slightly different. The way something looks different when you are different from the last time you looked at it. She looked at it now, and she thought about everything that had lived in the years between that diploma and this evening. The choices she had made. Some brave, some fearful, some made in love, and some in the slow confusion of a life that had gradually stopped feeling like hers. She did not regret the love. She wanted to be careful about that. She had loved Derek Ashford genuinely and completely, and that was not nothing, and it was not waste. Love is not waste. What is waste is the slow, incremental surrender of yourself in service of someone else's need to be unchallenged. That is the thing that had cost her. That is the thing she would not do again. Not from anger, from knowledge. There was a difference between the two, and the difference was everything. She changed out of the dress. She hung it carefully in the closet. The emerald green, in the dark of the closet, still holding the shape of the evening. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table. She thought about Monday, a presentation at a downtown conference. She had been preparing for 3 weeks, and it was good, and she knew it was good, and that knowledge sat in her without apology. She thought about Thursday, a follow-up meeting with Maxwell's team, the next phase of the Harrington restructuring, the specific argument she wanted to make about the third quarter projections that she thought was going to reframe the entire conversation. She thought about the paper she had been drafting for 6 weeks, an analysis of organizational resilience in post-restructuring environments, based on real data, based on 14 months of real work. She thought it might be worth submitting somewhere. She was going to submit it. She thought about her mother, who would call tomorrow morning and would want the full account. Donna Whitmore, 68 years old, who had kept a diploma in a box for 11 years on the faith that her daughter would come back for it. She thought about Peggy, who would require a minimum of 4 hours of debrief and would probably bring the flask. She thought about Helen Ashford and the look on her face on the balcony, the specific look of a woman who has been waiting to see something confirmed and has finally seen it. She thought about Brittany Cole, the wariness in her eyes before the ceremony, the soft openness afterward. Take care of yourself. She meant it. She hoped Brittany Cole found her way to somewhere clear and honest. She genuinely hoped this. She thought about Derek. She thought about him standing at the bar watching the door she had come through, the inventory of his face, the recognition, the recalibration, the thing that looked like loss, the understanding, arriving too late and too fully, of the factual error at the center of his story. She had not wanted to humiliate him. That was important to understand about herself. She had not gone to the wedding for humiliation. She had gone to see what she felt. She had felt clear, clean, free. He had wanted her to cry. He had needed the image of her grief as confirmation that his choices had cost nothing, that leaving her had been the correct arithmetic, and she was the remainder. She was not the remainder. She sat at the kitchen table in Evanston with her tea and the quiet of the apartment, and her whole life arranged ahead of her like a room that had been cleared of things that were never hers to begin with. She was 42 years old. She had an MBA from Northwestern and 14 months of consulting work that was building towards something significant, and a board presentation in her file that had held its line under pressure, and a paper nearly ready to submit, and a dinner to look forward to. She had a best friend who would bring a flask to a formal event and not apologize for it. She had a mother who had kept the evidence of who she was in a box for 11 years without being asked. She had a former mother-in-law who had sat on the bride's side of a wedding to send a message. She had, slowly and imperfectly, and without any single dramatic turning point, remembered who she was. Not reinvented, not rebuilt from scratch. Remembered. The word mattered, because it meant the person had been here the whole time, waiting. Patient, not gone. She thought about something she had read once, years ago, in a book she could not name now, about how people who have been slowly diminished often describe the return of themselves not as arrival, but as recognition, as turning a corner and seeing someone familiar. That was it. That was exactly it. She had turned a corner and seen someone she recognized. Herself. The door of her prison had been unlocked the whole time. She had been her own jailer. She had chosen, gradually, and then all at once, to stop. The tea was warm in her hands. The apartment was quiet around her. The diploma was on the wall in the next room. Outside, Chicago was doing what it did. Enormous and indifferent and full of ordinary, extraordinary things. The lake was out there in the dark. The buildings were lit. Somewhere on a street she would not pass tonight, Peggy Donovan was probably already composing the text she would send in the morning. Somewhere Maxwell Harrington was going home to whatever home looked like for him, carrying the evening with him in whatever way he carried things. Somewhere in a ballroom at the Meridian Grand Hotel, Derek Ashford was dancing at his wedding. She wished him a life that was honest. She meant this. She wished him a life that was real, rather than performed. Not from generosity exactly, from the understanding that performed lives cost everyone in them, eventually, more than they bargained for. She had paid that cost. She was done paying it. She finished the tea. She washed the cup. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the apartment settle around her and the distant quiet of the Evanston street, and she thought, without drama, without announcement, I am here. I am all the way here. She fell asleep. In the morning, the sun came through the window at the angle that always surprised her. That specific fall morning angle that made the wall above the dresser go gold. She had been waking up to this light for a year, and it still surprised her. She thought she might always be a little surprised by it. That seemed fine. She got up. She made the real coffee. The good kind, the 4-minute kind, the kind that smelled like something worth waking up for. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the small backyard and drank it while it was still hot. The invitation was long gone. She had thrown it away 3 weeks after she received it. She had not needed to keep it. The calligraphy and the cream-colored paper and the name that was supposed to erase her, she had not needed any of it anymore. Ms. Claire Whitmore. Yes, exactly. She had a conference presentation to prepare. She had a paper to finish. She had a Thursday meeting with the Harrington team and a dinner sometime soon with a man who paid actual attention. She had a phone call to make to her mother, who would want every detail. She had a life, a real one, hers, built with her own hands from the ground up, imperfect and specific, and entirely hers. She was 42 years old. She was just getting started, and that finally was exactly enough.
She didn't cry, not because she was performing strength, not because she had armored herself against feeling, but because she had done the deeper, harder, quieter work, the kind that doesn't make a sound, and she had arrived at last, at something real. Freedom. Not the kind that comes from winning, not the kind that comes from watching someone else lose, the kind that comes from waking up one morning and realizing that the person you were trying to get back to has been waiting for you the whole time. Patient, unchanged, still there. That is what this story is really about. Not the emerald dress, not the billionaire CEO, not the brass doors or the turned heads or the expression on one man's face when he understood what he had given up. It is about a woman who found her own diploma in a box on a shelf and understood, in that moment, that she had never stopped being the person who earned it. Here's what I want you to carry with you from this story. The people who diminish us are rarely monsters. That is the uncomfortable truth. They are ordinary people, sometimes people we loved deeply and genuinely, who needed us smaller so they could feel larger, who needed us uncertain so they could feel sure, who needed the mirror of us to reflect something back that they could live with. And we, because we loved them, because we were taught that love means accommodation, because the erosion happened so slowly and so gently that it never felt like violence, we made ourselves smaller. We folded ourselves. We put ourselves in boxes on guest room shelves and told ourselves we'd come back for it later. The lesson of this story is not that you should have fought harder. You were not wrong to love. You were not foolish to stay as long as you stayed. You were a person navigating something complicated with the tools you had at the time. The lesson is this: the door was never locked. The prison was real. The walls were real. The years of slowly learning to take up less space, those were real and they had weight and they cost something genuine. But the door? The door was always open. You are the one who decides when to walk through it. And walking through it does not require a grand gesture. It does not require an emerald dress or a public entrance or a moment witnessed by everyone who ever doubted you. It can be as quiet as buying the good coffee and drinking it slowly by the window. It can be as small as wearing the blazer in the color you actually love. It can be as private as hanging a diploma on the wall of a room that only you will see. The return to yourself is rarely dramatic. It is mostly small. It is mostly daily. It is made of 100 tiny decisions to stop apologizing for who you are and start simply being her. And here is what I want you to remember when the return feels impossible. Impossible is not the same as not yet. Starting over at 42, at 45, at 50, at 60, this is not failure. This is not evidence that you did something wrong. This is evidence that you are still alive, that the person you were before the erosion began is still in there, still waiting, still capable of everything she was always capable of. She kept your diploma. Whatever your diploma is, whatever piece of yourself you put in a box and covered with paper and told yourself you'd come back to later, she kept it. It is still there. You can have it back anytime you choose. The hardest moment in this story is not the entrance at the wedding. The hardest moment is a woman alone in a kitchen at midnight with a cold cup of tea, asking herself, who am I when I'm not someone else's wife? When I'm not someone else's story? When I'm not the person someone else needed me to be? That question is terrifying. It is also the beginning of everything, because when you stop being someone else's answer, you finally have room to become your own. She walked into that wedding not to hurt him, not to win, not to prove anything to a room full of people who had heard only one version of the story. She walked in to find out whether he still lived in her, whether 14 years of marriage and one devastating ending had left a piece of him permanently installed in the space where her confidence used to be. And she found out. He didn't. The space was hers. It had always been hers. The greatest thing you can do for yourself, after being made small, after being made invisible, after being told in 1,000 gentle ways that your fullness was inconvenient, is to come back. Not loudly, not necessarily publicly, but fully, completely, as yourself. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Final note. The content you just heard was manually researched, constructed, and edited by our team, built with intention, care, and a genuine desire to bring you stories that do more than entertain. Every word was chosen to carry meaning. Every chapter was crafted to reflect something real about the experience of women who have had to find their way back to themselves. We do not use automated generation without human judgment. We do not tell stories without purpose. This story, like every story on this channel, was made for you, by people who believe that the right story, heard at the right moment, can change the way you see yourself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. We'll see you in the next one.